Now we have discussed about the subject design of machine element. Topic is bearing. Introduce myself. I am Java Singh, Assistant Professor, Department of Mechanical Engineering. Now, introduction of bearing. Bearing is a machine element which support another moving machine elements known as journal. It permits a relative motion between the contact surface of the members while carrying a load. A little consideration will show that due to the relative motion between the contact surface, a certain amount of power is wasted in the overcoming frictional resistance, and if the roughing surface are in direct contact, where will be rapid wear in order to reduce the frictional resistance and wear, and in some cases to carry away the heat generated. A layer of fluid may be provided. The lubricant used to separate the journal bearing is usually a mineral oil refined from petroleum, but vegetable oils, silicon oils, grease, etc. may be used. Now, classification of bearing. Depending upon the direction of load to be supported, the bearing under this group are classified as radial bearing, thrust bearing. So in radial bearing, the load acts perpendicular to the direction of motion of the moving element, as so in figure. Then in thrust bearing, the load acting the along axis rotation as, so that is also given the figure. So you can see the diagram, the A part of diagram, that is the radial bearing, the B part radial bearing, then C part is thrust bearing. So that is a difference image of the bearings. So next, depending upon nature of contact, the bearing under this group is classified as sliding contact bearing and rolling contact bearing. In sliding contact bearing, as shown in figure, the sliding takes place along the surface of contact between the moving element and its fixed element. The sliding contact bearing are also known as plain bearing. In rolling contact bearing, see the steel balls or rollers. Steel balls or rollers are interposted between the moving and fixing element. The balls offer rolling friction at 2 points for each balls or roller. So that is a sliding contact bearing, the A part. Then B is a rolling contact bearing. That is a different type of sliding contact and rolling contact. Now, types of sliding contact bearing. The sliding contact bearing in which the sliding action is guided in a straight line and carrying radial load may be called slipper or guide bearing. Such type of bearing are usually found in crosscut and steam engine. The sliding contact bearing in which the sliding action is along the circumference of circle or an arc of the circle and carrying radial loads are known as journal or sleeve bearing. When the angle of contact of the bearing with the journal is 360 degree, then the bearing is called as full journal bearing. This type of bearing commonly used in industrial machinery to automotive bearing loaded in radial direction. When the angle of contact of the bearing with the journal is 120 degree, then the bearing is said to be partial journal bearing. This type of bearing has less friction and then full journal bearing, but it can be used only where the load is always one direction. The most common application of the partial journal bearing is found in rail load car axle. The full and partial journal bearing may be called clearance bearing because of the diameter of journal is less than that of bearing. The sliding contact bearing, according to the thickness of layer of the lubrication between the bearing and the journal, may all be classified as follows. Thickness, thick film bearing. The thick film bearing are those in which the working surface are completely separated from the each other by the lubricant. Such type of bearing are also called as hydrodynamic lubricant bearing. Thin film bearing. The thin film bearing are those is which, although lubricant is present, the working surface partially contact each other at least part of the time. Such type of bearing are almost called boundary lubricated bearing. Zero film bearing. The zero film bearing are those which operate without any lubrication present. Hydrodynamic or externally pressurized lubricant bearing. The hydrostatic bearing are those is can support steady load without any relative motion between the journal and bearing. This is achieved by forcing external pressurized lubricant between the member. Then hydrodynamic lubricant bearing. We have already discussed about the hydrodynamic bearing. There is a thick film of lubricant between the journal and bearing. A little consideration will show that when the bearing is applied with sufficient lubrication, a pressure is built up in the clearance space. When the journal is rotating about an axis that is eccentric with the bearing axis, the load can be supported by this fluid pressure without any actual contact between journal bearing. The load carrying ability of the hydrodynamic bearing arises simply because the viscous fluid is resisting purchased around. Under the proper condition, this resistance to motion will develop the pressure distribution in the lubrication film can support the useful load. So first, in the flow of viscous fluid conveying the channel known as wedge film lubrication, the resistance of viscous fluid is being sequence of from between the approaching surface known as the sequence film lubrication. So assumption in hydrodynamic lubrication bearing. The following basic assumptions are used in theory of hydrodynamic lubrication bearings. First one, the lubrication obey the Newton law of viscous flow. The pressure is assumed to be contact through a film thickness. The lubrication is assumed to be the incombustible. The viscosity is assumed to be the contact through the film. The flow is one dimensional. Example, the side leakage is neglected. So next important factor of the formation of thick oil film in hydrodynamic lubricated system bearing, lubrication bearing.